The good life in Ijibu was often accompanied by the gentle pulse of gossip, market women with brightly colored wrappers tied around their waists. They whispered in hushed tones about whose daughter was seeing whose son or who had purchased new farmland in the community. Secrets rarely remained hidden for long, yet somehow, not a single whisper in those initial days pointed to anything amiss with the pastor. Pastor John had a carefully maintained schedule. He would wake at the crack of dawn to pray, then attend to morning devotion with his wife and occasionally small groups of church members who came for spiritual counseling. In the afternoon, he might visit the sick or counsel couples. By evening, he often attended prayer meetings or led choir practice. But there were also nights when he claimed he had urgent church business in the neighboring town of Asaba. Asaba was larger than Ijibu, with a lively nightlife, good houses, and bars where city folk gathered. The pastor would explain that he had to attend revival programs or that he had leadership conferences with other pastors. In truth, these trips to Asaba were not always for pious gatherings. Late in the night, far from prying eyes, Pastor John would slip into bars or discreet meeting places, connecting with men who shared in his secret desires. Some were travelers passing through, others were young professionals living in Asaba who were equally cautious about their private lives in a society that rarely accepted such relationships. The pastor lived a life of contradiction, knowing that the same sermon he preached on Sunday advocating moral uprightness stood in tension with the clandestine passions he pursued in Asaba's quiet corners. He always returned to Ijibu before dawn, a cloak of guilt weighing heavily on him, though he concealed it behind the calm composure of a devoted shepherd. Even his wife, who knew him better than anyone else, saw only a devout man exhausted from countless church responsibilities. But the seed of secrecy had been planted, and seeds, when fed with enough secrecy, eventually sprout. Such was the lesson that the old women in the market had learned well. Even if the yam is hidden in the deepest part of the barn, they would say, the rats will still sniff it out. A few months passed, and everything in Entel seemed to move along as usual. Yet there were subtle changes. At first, only the very observant among the congregants noticed them, but soon whispers began to grow. First, there was the matter of the pastor's extended absences. The Great Light Ministries had a growing membership, and with that growth came more responsibilities. It seemed only natural that sometimes the pastor would need to travel for conferences and ministerial engagements. But the frequency of these trips began raising eyebrows. He used to be away for only a night or two every few months, now he sometimes disappeared 2 or 3 times in the same month. Second, certain men from Asaba began visiting Ijibu, claiming they had connections with the church or wanted to consult with the pastor on spiritual matters. They dressed somewhat differently, carried themselves in a more urban fashion, and though polite, rarely integrated with the local community. They would appear during midweek services, sitting far back or near the windows, and then vanish. Conversations would raise the curiosity of onlookers. Mama Ella, though busy, could not help but notice the strangeness. On a few occasions, she had gently probed her husband with questions about these visitors, but the pastor dismissed her concerns with a casual laugh. "My dear," he would say, "these are men who need spiritual guidance. The city life draws them into temptation, but they come here seeking the Lord." To an outsider, that explanation sufficed, but to a wife who had stood by his side for a decade, something felt amiss. She had lived with this man, prayed with him, watched him laugh, comfort the needy, and uphold the highest moral standards. Now there was an unfamiliar restlessness in his eyes. Sometimes he would hum softly in the mornings after returning from Asaba, as though recalling pleasant memories. She could sense a distance growing between them, a subtle rift neither of them acknowledged openly. The more she pressed, the more he preached sermons about trust and the importance of not letting jealousy into marriage. He reminded her that the devil often used suspicion to tear down God's institutions. Though his words sounded wise, Annie could not shake the feeling that something deeper was brewing. The church elders noticed too. They watched as the pastor delivered fiery sermons about morality and chastity, listened carefully when he spoke of the need for the congregation to remain pure in both body and spirit, to resist the temptations of the modern world. Despite the power of these sermons, an underlying tension simmered. Some elders sensed a dissonance, though none could quite articulate it. It was merely a slight unease, a question that hovered in the back of their minds. What is truly going on with our dear pastor? Then, as the Yuba say, when the wind blows, the chicken's rump is exposed. The wind was starting to blow in Ijibu, and soon enough, even the carefully hidden secrets could not remain forever in the dark. It began with a random encounter late one evening. A church elder by the name of Daniel had traveled to Asaba to purchase materials for repairing the church roof. He was an elder known for his uprightness, and he had always admired Pastor John for his spiritual guidance. After settling into a small guest house, Daniel decided to venture out to get a meal at a local buka. On his way, he noticed a recognizable figure stepping out of a secluded building, partially hidden by tall fences. The figure was none other than Pastor John. Beside him was a well-dressed young man. Daniel could see that they were engrossed in conversation, their faces lit by the muted glow of a nearby street lamp. Even from a distance, there was an unmistakable intimacy in their body language, leaning close, exchanging a look of warmth that transcended mere friendship. Daniel stopped in his tracks, uncertain how to approach the situation. Should he call out to the pastor? Should he pretend he had not seen them? Before he could decide, the pastor and the young man slipped into a waiting car and disappeared into the night. That single sight was enough to stir confusion in the old man's heart. He struggled with it, praying all through the night for clarity. The next morning, in a bid to maintain respect for the pastor, Daniel left Asaba without confronting him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and like all seeds, it sought the light of day. Back in Ijibu, Daniel tried to hold on to his silence. He felt conflicted. On the one hand, his loyalty to the pastor prompted him to keep quiet. On the other, he believed it was the responsibility of an elder to investigate potential wrongdoing within the church. Torn by this inner struggle, he confided in his wife, an action that would have grave repercussions for Daniel. His wife was a kind-hearted woman but also one who believed in transparency at all costs. In her view, secrets were like poison that could destroy a community. It did not take long before a rumor sprang up: the pastor has been seen in Asaba at night conducting a business that is not godly. The rumor was vague, floating through the church congregation like a restless spirit. Some dismissed it immediately, while others, recalling the strangeness of the pastor's visitors, gave it credence. As with all rumors, it grew, morphing with each retelling. Before 2 weeks had passed, whispers circulated that the pastor was living a double life. Some believed he might be involved in shady financial dealings, while others went so far as to suspect extramarital affairs. The congregation, once unified, began to divide into camps, those who fiercely defended the pastor and those who felt uneasy about the swirling uncertainties. Mama Ella, quietly observing everything, found herself in a state of internal turmoil. She had noticed changes in her husband's behavior, yes, but she still trusted him. For years he had been her rock, her spiritual guide, and the love of her life. Yet now, as the rumor mill churned, she had to confront the possibility that maybe her intuition about his absences was correct. Dark clouds loomed over the Great Light Ministries, and it felt as though a storm was gathering, soon to unleash havoc on the entire congregation. Around this time, tension within the Great Light Ministries reached a boiling point. The congregation was abuzz with gossip, eyes were watchful, and hearts were unsettled. Some of the younger men who used to come from Asaba had stopped appearing at Sunday service, likely to avoid prying eyes. The pastor, sensing the rising tide of suspicion, tried to refocus his energies on church activities. He poured himself into prayer sessions, visited the sick, and even organized a large revival program in an attempt to reaffirm his position as a man of God. Nevertheless, the unease remained, like a persistent fever. When a man tries to sweep his tracks from the sand, a new gust of wind often reveals them again. So it was with Pastor John. The more he tried to hide, the more the truth seemed determined to emerge. One day after a particularly spirited Sunday service, a group of elders cornered Pastor John in his office. Daniel, already troubled by his Asaba sighting, was among them. They insisted that the rumors in the congregation could not be ignored and that it was time for him to clear the air. The pastor, eyes blazing with indignation, accused them of spreading lies. He threatened to remove from leadership anyone who failed to trust him. The elders retreated, uncertain how to handle his fury, but they left with even heavier hearts. The confrontation did not dispel their doubts, it only added to the simmering tension. Meanwhile, Mama Ella's private world was crumbling. She could no longer ignore the late-night phone calls that he ended abruptly whenever she drew near, his fleeting affectionate gestures toward her that felt forced. The haunting recollection of a gentle loving man was replaced by someone distant and agitated. Late one night, after a heated argument sparked by her questions about his church duties in Asaba, the pastor stormed out of the house. In her desperation and heartbreak, Annie reached out to a close confidant, Sister Taupe, who was as close as a sister. Confessing. It felt like betraying her husband, yet she needed to unburden her soul. Sister Taupe listened, shedding tears of sympathy, for she too had heard the rumors. Only God knows what is true, she whispered, but the truth always comes to light. A few weeks after that emotional night, the Great Light Ministries organized a major revival that had been months in the making. A guest speaker from Lagos was invited, and church members from neighboring villages poured into Ijebu. The church compound was alive with the sound of joyous singing, lively drumming, and an outpouring of worship. Festive banners adorned the gates, and the choir, resplendent in white garments, led soul-stirring hymns. On the final evening of the program, just as the guest speaker was about to ascend the pulpit, a disturbance erupted at the back of the church. Two men were quarreling, their voices becoming louder by the second. Initially, the ushers tried to calm them, but to no avail. The congregation turned in unison, shocked by the commotion. One of the men was a familiar face, a young man named Day, who had visited from Asaba in the past. The other was a local man who claimed to have overheard Day's hushed phone conversation that night. In a swirl of accusations, Day declared that the local man had insulted him, calling him the pastor's secret lover. Incensed, Day threatened to expose all he knew if the insults did not cease. In that charged moment, fueled by anger, shame, and a sense of betrayal, Day blurted out details of his relationship with Pastor John. He told of clandestine meetings in Asaba, nights spent together in gu houses, and phone calls laced with terms of endearment. His words resounded through the church, falling like stones in a still pond, each sentence causing ripples of shock. There was a collective gasp. One could hear people groaning in disbelief, while others wept openly. Some jumped to their feet, their faces flushed with outrage. A handful of ushers rushed to pull Day away, but the damage was done. Like a stone thrown through glass, the truth shattered the congregation's illusions. The respected pastor, revered for his moral teachings, had been entangled in secret affairs. At the altar stood the guest speaker, who stared in confusion, uncertain how to proceed. In the front row, the elders sat frozen, their eyes on the pastor. And in her seat, clad in her magnificent geli and lace, sat Mama Annie, trembling. Pastor John, who had been preparing to introduce the guest speaker, was suddenly in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. He looked out at his congregation, faces contorted in shock, anger, sadness, betrayal, and realized there was no denying it anymore. The day after the revival, the Great Light Ministries was plunged into chaos. People gathered in small pockets throughout the church premises. Some cried, others fumed, while still others remained quietly stunned, unsure what to say or think. The church elders convened for an emergency meeting, with many calling for the pastor's immediate removal. Others, citing Christian mercy, proposed a suspension and a process for the pastor to seek redemption and counseling. In the midst of the heated debate, the question of leadership weighed heavily. Who would lead the church if the pastor was disgraced? Outside that elders' meeting, the reaction among congregants was equally tense. Some insisted that the pastor's personal life was between him and God, pointing out that everyone sins differently. Others were unyielding, declaring that his hypocrisy had disqualified him from remaining a spiritual leader. Within the pastor's home, the atmosphere was equally fraught. Wordlessly, he and Mama Eni navigated their once happy domain like strangers. Her eyes were red from crying, her once composed face now etched with lines of grief. He tried to approach her to speak, but she refused to hear him. Shame and guilt weighed heavily on him. Later that evening, a group of elders visited the pastor at his home. They demanded an explanation, a confession, anything that could provide clarity. At first, he bristled, his pride causing him to deny the allegations, but then he broke down, weary from the burden of maintaining his double life. In tears, he acknowledged the truth. Yes, he had been having relationships with men for years, hiding it under the mantle of pastoral authority. Yes, he had lied to his wife, to the congregation, and even to himself. Silence filled the room as his words sank in. At last, Daniel, his eyes full of compassion despite the betrayal, asked, "Why, my son? Why this secrecy?" The pastor, face glistening with tears, could barely speak, but in halting phrases, he told them of his lifelong struggle with his desires, his fear of condemnation, and his sense of responsibility as a pastor. He was tormented by a society that scorned any sign of same-sex attraction, by a doctrine that condemned it as a grave sin, and by the internal conflict of truly caring for his wife yet feeling an undeniable pull to men. Fear, he said, had forced him into silence, and in that silence, his secret life had grown like a cancer, eating away at his soul. That night, the elders departed in sober reflection. They had come to demand answers but left with a tragic story of human frailty. Outside, the tropical moon hung low, its silver beams illuminating the dusty roads of Eel, and for the first time in his life, Pastor John felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The truth, in all its scandalous weight, was finally known. In Ijibu, the cultural and moral implications of the pastor's revelation were immediate. Homosexual relationships were largely taboo, especially in traditional rural communities. Even among the more progressive circles, there was great hesitance to openly accept such relationships. The pastor's case was further complicated by the fact that he was a spiritual leader who had preached passionately about moral rectitude. Some members of the Great Light Ministries clamored for the local authorities to get involved, suspecting wrongdoing despite the adult and consensual nature of the relationships. Others cited the national climate, where homosexuality often faced legal repercussions. The tension between cultural norms, religious dogma, and the complexity of personal freedom flared up into a serious debate. Families argued within their homes, local bars teemed with heated discussions, and market stalls buzzed with opinionated chatter. Concerned for the pastor's well-being, some of his close friends urged him to go into hiding or relocate. The possibility of mob action was real, as was the risk of formal legal trouble. But there were also voices of reason urging calm and calling for a compassionate approach. Daniel, for one, insisted that no violence should be done and that no one should take the law into their hands. "Vengeance is not ours," he pleaded, "and if we seek to punish him, we become the very beasts we claim to condemn." Yet the emotional toll of the revelation extended far beyond the pastor. Mama Eni became something of a tragic figure. She faced shame and pity from some quarters, while others blamed her for not controlling her husband. Torn between her own heartbreak and the public scrutiny, she retreated from the community, spending most of her days in solitude, grappling with her own sense of betrayal and confusion. In the days that followed, the church's elders reached a preliminary decision. Pastor John would be placed on indefinite suspension, with the possibility of formal expulsion pending further discussion. A transitional leadership council would oversee church affairs. That evening, the pastor sat alone in his empty church office for one final time, reflecting on the wave of chaos his actions had unleashed. The stained glass windows shimmered with the fading light of dusk. He thought about the journey that led him here, the guilt, the hidden passions, the contradictory life. He prayed quietly, not so much for forgiveness but for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The dust eventually settled, as it always does after a great storm. The Great Light Ministries went through a period of strife and self-reflection. Attendance fluctuated, some members left, seeking other churches that had cleaner reputations, while others stayed committed to rebuilding. The Transitional Council, guided by a visiting bishop, led the church in a series of soul-searching dialogues. Over time, a more measured perspective began to emerge among a small but growing faction of the congregation. They recognized that while the pastor's duplicity was undeniably hurtful, it also highlighted the destructive power of enforced secrecy and rigid judgment. Some pointed out that just as the pastor had sinned by being dishonest, the church community might also bear responsibility for fostering an atmosphere where honesty was terrifying. Not everyone agreed with this view, but the conversation marked the beginning of a slow, cautious shift. Meanwhile, new leadership took hold, focusing on humility, transparency, and the necessity of balancing moral standards with empathy. What of Pastor John? He withdrew from public life for a time, staying with a distant relative in another town. News filtered back occasionally. Some said he was undergoing counseling and spiritual guidance, while others heard rumors that he was seeking a way to live more openly or perhaps leave the country for a place where his orientation would not be criminalized. The truth was less dramatic. He spent his days in quiet reflection, acknowledging his fault, mourning the loss of his beloved calling, and trying to understand what it meant for his future. As for Mama Annie, she vacated the pastor's residence for a while. She lived with relatives in a nearby village. The heartbreak was deep, and it would take time to heal, but she was surrounded by family who loved her without condition. Though she felt betrayed, she also felt pity for the man she once adored, recognizing that he too was caught in a bind of society's making. Over the course of a year, the name John became less frequently spoken in Eel. Life moved on, weddings still happened, children were born, farmland was cultivated, and each Sunday, a new voice stood at the pulpit to deliver sermons. Yet the memory of his revelation lingered in the undercurrents, reminding the villagers of how easily secrets could tear apart the most revered reputations. Some years later, the story of Pastor John became something of a local folk tale in Ijebu, retold in hushed tones at gatherings or used as a cautionary tale by parents admonishing their children about honesty and integrity. Yet, unlike many folk tales where a villain gets punished or a hero triumphs, this tale had no neat conclusion. Instead, it became a narrative about human complexity, cultural tension, and the cost of living behind masks. Elders would say he deceived his wife and the congregation. He must bear the consequences. Others would counter he is a human being too, tormented by desires he could not control. We must show compassion. The debate was never fully resolved, reflecting the broader societal conflict between long-held beliefs and the reality of human diversity. Still, one enduring lesson stood out: secrets, once watered by fear, grow into entangling vines that can strangle even the most robust of reputations. When the truth emerges, it tears through the walls of deception, leaving behind debris in all directions. Eel learned through painful experience that the unveiling of secrets could lead to condemnation but also to moments of deeper understanding. After all, it was during the church's darkest hour that a seed of compassion and open-mindedness began to sprout, ever so slowly.